So I'm going to share with you a story that comes out of an interview that I heard on the way to the airport. And as I was hearing it, was one of those, oh, thank you for my sermon when I get back. Now I can have a real holiday. Because I already had picked the passage. And it turns out that on the way to the airport, I was listening to an interview by Anna Maria Tremonti on The Current. And she was interviewing two people simultaneously. The woman, and I'm just going to read I'll set it up a bit more, and then I'll just read some excerpts from other articles I found out about these people. The woman was, Margot van Sleutman is her name. She's about my age, and about 40 years ago, her father was shot in one of these shouldn't have happened, but a couple of guys were robbing a Brinks truck outside of the Hudson Bay where her father worked, and her father tried to intervene, and he just got shot, and it was a terrible accident. And she herself had spent years developing her own sense of wholeness and restoration beyond the death of her father, who was shot when she was 10 years old. And in fact, she was a writer, and so she also offered writing classes, therapeutic writing classes for people who had to heal from their own traumatic backgrounds. And so she became a little bit of a public figure when the wife of the man who had shot her father kind of came upon her. And Glenn, who's the man who shot her father, had done his time and very, very, very much wanted to reach out to her and seek her forgiveness. And when he did reach out to her, she spoke about in the interview how she called her mother and said, I've just talked to the man who shot, and her family was horrified, just horrified, that she would seek any kind of connection with this man whose actions, were the end of life as the family they had known. But she decided that in order to contribute to her own healing, and quite possibly the healing of the planet, and to provide models of reconciliation between people with whom there had been incredible hurt, that she had to meet this man. So I'm just going to read from a few places here. For their first meeting, they chose Westminster Abbey, which was a Benedictine monastery on a rise above the Fraser River in Mission, BC. So Sherry, who was Glenn's wife, picked up Margot at the airport and then delivered her to Glenn van Sleutman. And then Margot remembers it this way. I said to him, "You must be John Glendon Flett." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "I am Margaret van Sleutman." And we looked at each other and we started to cry. And we hugged. And we cried for a while. And he said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And I said, I know. I believe you. There have been a number of meetings since, and first by happenstance and then by design, she began conducting writing workshops in jails and remand centers, and her work then became paralleled with Flett's work after he'd done his 30 years. And I'll say more about him lately. And she has sought his advice. It took almost 30 years to meet one of her father's killers, to get her questions answered, and to see where they were both locked into a sentence running since April 27th, 1978. She accepted his apology at the Abbey because she needed the release as much as he did. So this is Glenn's story. So the murder happened in 1978, for which he was convicted and imprisoned. In the winter, and while I'm reading this, I really want you to hear Jesus' words in the background. Right? He's inviting people to go to another place. And I think these stories are a reflection of people who've managed to go to another place with incredible courage and grace. In the winter of 1982, a tremendous life-changing event occurred that made me look at the world in a brand new way. I accepted Jesus into my life while serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison for the most horrendous crime a person can commit, murder. 5 years prior, while robbing a Brinks truck, I shot and killed an innocent man named Theodore Van Sleitman. I was brought up in a good family. My parents tried so hard to change the path I had chosen. They introduced me to my grandfather's dear friend, Dr. Reverend Emma Smiley, and also the head of the Truth Center in Victoria. Initially, I attended that church against my will. Eventually, I grew to love Reverend Smiley, mainly because she loved me. My mom said that Reverend Smiley saw life through rose-colored glasses. After my conversion experience in prison, I began to live the teachings of Jesus as closely as I could. I wrote to Reverend Smiley about my change. She was so overjoyed and told me to live my life in a loving way. I started to really care about those around me, both inmates and guards. 1 year after giving my life to God, I had the greatest test of faith I have ever been given. One night I called home and my dad answered the phone. He told me that someone had broken into Reverend Smiley's home and beat her to death. I went numb. I couldn't grasp what he was saying. I felt sick and overwhelmed. About 9 months after her murder, the young man who killed her was convicted and sent to the same penitentiary in which I was incarcerated. Revenge would have been so easy. However, I knew Reverend Smiley would not want that. She had always said that we needed to forgive and let go. I started to have a relationship with this person. Years later, I attended his parole hearing when he was released. Through it all, I felt the Reverend smiling down on me. She loved me and everyone she met, even her killer. She was truly a follower of the teachings of Jesus. When I was released from prison in 1992, I founded a support group for inmates and their families called Long-Term Inmates Now in Community. Since 1995, my wife and I searched for ways to give back to the victim community. Margine spoke to me about the idea of a healing center for survivors. We had been looking into social enterprise businesses for some time when an opportunity arose to manage a community garden in Mission, BC. Some of the vegetables grown were sold at the local farmers market to help fund a support group for victims of homicide. We learned quickly that you have to grow a lot of squash to make money. For that reason, we leased an 8-acre parcel of land from the District of Mission, and thus Emma's Acres, named in honor of Reverend Emma Smiley, was born. Emma's Acres is truly incredible. Today, inmates come out on escorted passes and work release. Join us and work to make the dream come true. The first person hired for the project was Ray King Sr., whose son was murdered by a high-profile offender. He, too, has become my friend. It feels good to hear him talk about our project and how it has brought light back into his life after living in hell for so long. I am so thankful that I listened to Reverend Emma Smiley. My vision of restorative justice puts victims and survivors first. The people who work at Emma's Acres can't change what they did, but they can acknowledge their responsibility and do all they can to make a difference now. This is real restorative justice, because the community and offenders work together to help bring healing and peace to victims. The project is succeeding because people from different walks of life are assisting. It's an example in action of what Reverend Smiley used to say: live life lovingly. I would argue that the only place where the message of Jesus is made manifest in its deepest forms is in the context of conflict. Like he said in another passage, so you love your friends. Big deal. Anyone can love their friends. The only hope for the world, for your own sense of peace and your own sense of healing, is for you, for me to hear the invitation to love as inviting us to stretch way beyond our comfort zone. So if this invitation does not feel uncomfortable, We have not heard it. So during this time for contemplation, I invite you to expand your comfort zone. Expand beyond the liberal notion of political correctness. And pay attention to where the Spirit is calling you to let go of your grudges. Let go of your place where you are convinced you are right. And inviting you to expand your heart in response to the gospel invitation.